Hi, welcome to the Dennis Report. I'm Dennis Atchison. Not that long ago, the province experienced Tropical Storm Arthur. And in the process of enduring that storm, we also saw the crews from NB Power out working hard to restore power for everybody. We also learned how sensitive or fragile our infrastructure is when it comes to sustaining and maintaining power. We also learned some things we could be doing in our own household to make sure that we're okay for a few days if, in the event, we don't have power. Today's guest will give us great insight, depth, and understanding to the back room and the back work that goes into maintaining our provincial power grid system. Ross Galbraith is the business manager for IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 37, here in New Brunswick. You would know that as the NB Power crews that work out on the lines and stuff. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dennis. Nice to be here.
And thanks for coming. It's a beautiful sunny day today, and we're indoors under light, so
that's all right.
Thanks for taking time. So we can start in 1,000 directions, but most recent in most people's minds was the storm about 3-4 weeks ago. People will see the crews out there, but they won't know the mechanics behind the scenes, and it was a special event. It was larger than normal. Could you give us a behind-the-scenes glimpse of what that's like sometimes for the people that work out there and how intense it is?
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny, the line workers in particularly, you know, they're really heroes. Like, they really work hard to restore power. So, I mean, most of us, if there's a huge blizzard or something like that, we're saying we're not going anywhere. They love to restore the power. And, you know, when things are at its worst, I know that I've had line workers tell me that they've never felt better. Like, you know, because they, you know, it's like, you know, somebody that's just, you know, firefighter maybe going to try to rescue people in a burning building. Like, they get that kind of, you know, strong feelings about restoring power, right?
Yep. Rise to the moment.
Yeah, exactly. You know, they're heroes. They truly are. And under very challenging conditions, whether you think of the ice storm this past winter, or you know what happened after Arthur. But the thing that it's so important is that they do their work safely. One thing I've noticed, you know, the IBEW represents a lot of line workers across North America, and you know, every year there's 12 or 15 line workers who are killed. And so we've got such a strong emphasis on safety and in doing work safely, and that's got to be the first and foremost thing, because we keep, you know, talking to the folks that are involved, and NB Power also has a very strong emphasis on safety, because, you know, if you don't take the time to do it right and do it safely, it'll take longer to restore the power. So I know our folks will work as hard, you know, they work long hours. But it's so important. Like, it's almost like a horse that wants to go too fast. Sometimes you got to say, you know, slow down a bit so you can do it safely, and you can get the power on, and you know, and you go home as well to have your time with your family afterwards.
It's fascinating where moments happen and we get to learn something that maybe we took for granted, and then something shifts, and then we get to see it through new eyes. So watching how the media tracked the story of how long before the power comes back on, and then so it's 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, and the range of people affected by not having power. It's somewhere in all of that are lessons for households to be ready for 3 days or 4 days without power. Is that tied into some of the work too, trying to help people be aware that if the power is down for a few days, what they need to do?
Yeah, I'm going to back it up a little bit. I mean, I think that our power has been so reliable in New Brunswick. We've had very good reliability compared to some other jurisdictions, right? But sometimes folks forget that it is an essential service, and then how, you know, different our lives can be when we don't have electricity, right? You know, it's easy to take it for granted when, you know, up until this last year, you know, many people, you know, might go years without having an outage, and even if they did, it was maybe only a few minutes, right?
Yep.
It does go to show you that, you know, this wide-flung infrastructure that we have, when we have, you know, big weather events or other types of things, it can create some problems. You know, utilities are very good if it's just a storm that hits one area or another, but when you get widespread damage across a large geographic area, it makes it so hard to fix things, right? Or if you get a lot of physical destruction, such as Arthur, when all the trees pulled,
Pulled everything
the
down.
wires and poles down, like you just can't reinstall that stuff overnight. It takes a long time to do it, right? And so I think that these big weather events do, bring it to the forefront of people's minds. And I know that, one thing that the IBEW across North America, we've always been strong advocates in making sure we maintain a power system that's reliable for everybody, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's two extremes for that. One is you could have a line worker standing in every corner, and then on the other extreme you don't have any line workers, right?
Yep.
And we're somewhere in the middle there, and I think that when things like this happen, it reinforces the message we've been trying to say, that it is an essential service, like our healthcare system, or and other things where we really need it. So hopefully it will allow us to maintain what's been a very reliable system, and hopefully it will continue to be reliable going forward.
So following that theme then, is it hard to get traction in the larger social conversation with the need to invest in infrastructure? Because it'll get into that push-pull about what the priorities are.
That's right. So it's challenging. People today, it's hard. The economy's been hard with a lot of things, a lot of things that have happened, right? And I know that folks will see their power bill and they'll say, "Look at my power bill," and it's too high. And but it's not like a private company, and there are some private power utilities where they're shuffling profits off to shareholders that may live anywhere, right?
Yep.
And this is a crown corporation, and any profit they make, they're either paying down debt, resources they've used to build infrastructure,
yep,
or they're putting it back into the system to maintain it and make sure it can stay reliable, right?
Yep.
And we've had times over the years where governments have imposed zero rate increases, and that's great for the consumer, but it does have an impact, right? Because then the utility will be forced to do things with maybe fewer resources than would be wise, and eventually it can catch up with you, right? So Galbraith Power's done a very good job, but there's other utilities where they've done a poor job, and people have certainly paid the price.
That brings up an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
People in general think linear, so we want to have cheaper power. I don't want my power bill to go up. We're in the middle of an election right now, but the theme runs past elections. We want smaller government, more efficient government. But somewhere down the road, it gets too thin, too lean, or it never loops back into the essential service. So that those people calling for smaller governments or less money on public infrastructure, at some point, it'll come back to find you in another form, another day, another way. So how do we have a more fruitful conversation about that instead of a conflict-based or a crisis management conversation? Because by then it's almost too late. For scrambling because these towers needed to be replaced and we waited 30 years too long.
I think that's the challenge, right? Because if you're just trying to put food on your table, that's your most immediate concern, right? And the bigger picture, or even other public services, like in Atlantic Canada, we know that there are high levels of low levels of literacy. Something like 56% of Atlantic Canadians have low levels of literacy, right? Mm-hmm. And so that would suggest we need to put more money into our public education system, right? But if you're a government and you've got X amount of resources and you're saying, healthcare system, education, this, that, and the other thing, it's easy to kind of say, well, maybe we're going to put it over here and not invest in as much as in education, or maybe we're investing more but it's still not enough, right? Because the literacy levels are still low, right? Yeah. The long term, that will cost more money.
Yes.
But in the short term, it allows you to get it by. And I think that's a problem just with the system a little bit, in that it is more focused on what do we need in the next, if you're a business, maybe the next quarter or the next business cycle. If you're a government, maybe the next election cycle. Taking a longer term strategic vision, is a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot, but it's maybe not happening as much as it should, right? And I think that society has to get a handle on that, because at the end of the day, like you said, we will pay the price one way or the other.
Yeah, because all of the pieces are connected.
Yeah.
So that begs almost a better conversation.
Yeah.
because we stay within the same paradigms all the time. So here's all these competing needs at the table. So here's the infrastructure needs for guarantee of power supply. Here's the healthcare needs for that, education needs, and it's always brought to the table as competing needs. There was a time, to turn it a touch, when unions were very proactive in creating social change back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, for some of that traction for the new ideas to finally have some momentum and some mass, because unions could bring their mass to it. So the weekend and paid leave and all those are almost archetypal now things from the movement, but there's a whole new series of challenges in front of us. So maybe in a way the conversation from IBEW or from you starts to get us on a more positive shared strategy grounds. Have you ever run into the opportunity to actually make that happen?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, like, I'm very proud. That's the way I try to do things. I mean, I think I have that bigger picture view, and I do look at things, and I know through the years, I've been active on behalf of the IBEW here in New Brunswick around things like, what's the right electrical system for the province? Like, what makes the most sense? Because, you know, we've always, our major message is we want a system that's reliable, because we live in this province and our families live in this province. We want it good, right? Yeah. And focused on things like that. And I know that, you know, my local, we've, before my time, it started before me, but we've certainly run with it as a, you know, comprehensive training and education program for our members. It's focused more on soft skills, more so than technical skills, because then people are, they're transferable, right? Because you either the kind of soft skills, whether it's communication or conflict resolution, you can use that in the workplace. You know, it's important skill sets for anybody. But also when folks leave work, you know, they're coaching that softball team or they're involved in their community. And so those things help, I think, our communities be better. And so definitely of, you know, my union and my local and other leaders within it, we've, you know, focused on those types of things, like kind of the bigger picture things, and we do our job day to day. You know, another area we talk about, and hopefully we're continuing to push for positive changes around safety. You know, that's something we've come a long way, but there's still more that we have to do. And you know, it's funny, I had an opportunity, we had some union leaders visit here from Argentina, and you know, they wanted to pick our brains around safety, and 2 years later I had an email from one of them, and they'd been successful in achieving some positive legislation in their country. So, you know, I'm proud of things like that, where you can help others, you know, not just here in New Brunswick, but live safer, more productive lives, right? Yeah.
I like to riff down the union themes message a little bit. For the most part, generally today, unions are kind of put in a box about they're only looking after themselves. And much of what you've already said already branches into how it's so much more. So some of that is the general public's perception that unions are just self-interested and they jack up costs and all that negative stuff. But unions are also responsible to be agents of social change, and but they need to change their messaging a little bit too in order to get that to resonate. Sounds like you've had some success with how that could be.
I think so, you know, and some of the things I've been involved with over the years, like one of the things I noticed is that, you know, if a journalist contacts you frequently, you know, I think the stereotypical, well, if this happens, what's the impact on jobs, right? And, you know, when we talked about the electrical system in this province, that would be the question would come up. And, you know, I don't want to be pigeonholed, you know, because I think our interests are wider than that. And so, you know, I would, you know, steer more into the area of, you know, what we want, because we are citizens of this province and our families live here and our friends. We need a good system that's reliable for everybody, right? So instead of focusing on what might be impact or jobs or not, or impact on wages, it was really about the bigger picture that I think we all have a shared interest in, right? And so, you know, I'm mindful of that there are stereotypes that I don't think reflect most of the union leaders I know. And so I try to steer away from those and talk about the other good things that we're doing, because hopefully, you know, we can educate folks about what we're up to, and you know, it's so frustrating, you know, if there is a labor dispute. And I know last year in the IBEW, so, you know, 700,000 members across North America, in our system, if a local union gets to the point where they think it's necessary to have a strike, they need to seek approval of our international president. Okay, so last year I think there was only 5 or 6 times that happened, and only I think things that were strikes, and they were both settled very early. I'm pretty sure those are the numbers. But the average person on the street might think that unions are in a strike all the time, and we're not. So when we do something and we can resolve something, or we strike a deal that's really good and it helps the company where our members are employed be successful, that's not news. It's not sexy. It doesn't get reported, right?
Yep.
So all people hear are the bad news things, but the bad news is this much of the good stuff.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, completely with you. I remember from a past life and previous job going to the Labor History Project that was presenting for the first time some research done on the province on labor history. Watched 8 presentations. All of it was conflict. All of it was deaths or disaster or safety. Rightly so, it's part of the history. But there was no successes like you just described. And my other research had shown that 98% of the time a deal is struck. It's only that 2% of the time when it's going to go to a strike vote, and even then it doesn't always get to a strike action.
Yeah.
And so I asked around the table, where's the successes? If this was the Toronto Maple Leafs, heaven forbid, and they'd won the Stanley Cup that many times through successful negotiations, they'd be hanging the banners from the rafters. Or why doesn't the business community acknowledge unions as forces in the business world that create good things and work out deals? Because if you were signing that many contracts out of an Irving or a McCain or an IT company and keeping, it's funny how that's never come to sit with the common knowledge of.
Sometimes
of
it's hard to prove a negative, so when there's good work done on a collective agreement, companies are successful, the employees are sharing in that success through good jobs. It's a company that's successful. Not necessarily a news story, right? It's when the company goes under or there's a big labor dispute, that's news, right? And so it's unfortunate, like the other ones just don't attract the same attention. But I'll share one with you. I was involved with a collective agreement with one of our bargaining units, and several years ago, and we adopted, I think, some very progressive things that allowed the business to be very successful, in the context of which it operated on. Employees, could work with one another. We didn't pigeonhole people into silos, so everybody could work together.
All the things people don't think of when commonly thinking of a collective agreement. You were flexible and adaptable.
Correct.
And proactive.
Yeah, and so on that particular set of negotiations, we had some interest. We wanted to make sure that people were safe. We want to say that if people are flexible and working together, is this going to have a negative impact on their employment? So we were able to deal with that a little bit. And so, both parties had interest, and we were able to come together with a deal that worked for each other, right? Now, a person that was working on those negotiations on behalf of the employer is a guy that specialized in negotiations, and he negotiated collective agreements right around North America. And he was involved with negotiations for the Nalcor Muskrat Falls project and putting together a project labor agreement. And they actually based it on some of the things that we had done 10 years before here in New Brunswick. And I've since talked to this gentleman, and he sees it as a best practice for a large project like that, like a large infrastructure project, because what's hurt a lot of those projects in the past is when there are disputes or they go severely over budget, and then everybody loses, right? And so they were using some of the things that we had done as a best practice, and to help that project be successful. And strong emphasis on safety and on getting it done. It's pretty good, but that's a big story on a $10 billion project, and that story's not being told. I'm kind of happy about it.
Yeah, and it's team building.
Yeah.
And adaptable, flexible.
Yeah.
That leads into a little bit of the changing job market. Collective agreements tend to be negotiated on a 4-year cycle.
Well, it's negotiable. I've done ones that are 2 years, 1 year, and 5 years, and 8 years. So.
Okay, great. Because then that gets into how jobs have changed. The nature of work has changed. So you have casual contracts. You've got 2-year contracts, and so that steps out of that pattern, or shows a union can be adaptable to meet the current work conditions.
Yeah, whatever makes the most sense. I know an IBEW local that representing workers in the pulp industry had agreed to a 10-year contract at one time because that particular industry and that particular plant needed some stability.
Yeah.
That's an industry where there's a lot of competition overseas and whatnot, and so the union agreed, let's do something that creates some stability, right? And I know that was a tough. At the beginning, I know the leaders that were involved, like some of the members, like, why are we accepting such a long contract? But I think it proved itself. I know some of the things, like in the agreement I talk about, where we had some flexibility and we had mutual interests. Initially, people were like, "Geez, what does this mean?" or "What's it going to mean?" Right? And a couple of years afterwards, I had a couple of calls where people saying, "I think that's the best contract that we ever had," and they like it. So. It takes some bravery to kind of say we need to do something different,
Yep.
And I think that if people, an employer and a union, their interest is in making sure that they can have good jobs and successful businesses, because they go hand in hand. It's a symbiotic relationship, right?
Very much.
And they can be creative. You can come up with things that'll help a business and create employment and maintain good jobs.
Yep. That ties to the theme around the Moosehead lockout 3-4 years ago, and helping coach the spokespeople for that local. But what's your biggest passion? What's in your heart? Like, I love this company. I want it to be successful.
Yeah.
And they delivered that message, which was awesome, which helped change the timbre or the tone of the conversation. Be nice if we provincially were able to do that on a larger scale. That kind of be grateful for all that we have and all that infrastructure we have, and then how do we move it forward? How long have you been in this labor movement stuff now?
I've been working full time for the IBEW for 18 years now, and it was not a career I had foreseen before that. So, it's I guess I'm getting to be one of the elder statesmen, maybe.
Yeah. So one day you'll be in history books.
I don't know about that, but it's usually not. Maybe it's not a good thing if you get in the history books. But,
who knows? There's lots of good examples for us to follow. We need them.
Yeah. But on that point you said earlier, an important philosophy that I've adopted, and it just made sense to me. And I should back up a bit. I find that I always consider myself a bit of an outsider. I didn't grow up necessarily in a union family. Although my grandfather had been a senior leader within his union at a very high level, the international level. But he died when I was 1, so I never knew him. And so I went to work for MB Power and find myself in a unionized environment. I was just interested in having an influence on the way the environment, and my work environment was. I just wanted a good environment for everybody.
Sure.
And so that was kind of why I got involved. But philosophy I adopted is, others taught me the wisdom of this is being, you can, if there's an issue, you can be hard on that issue, but you can be soft on the people, right? And so sometimes folks don't have the tools to have a productive conversation in an area that might be riddled with conflict.
Yep.
And so it gets personal, right? And I attack you, you attack me, and instead of saying, Dennis, I think, having some faith, Dennis is a good guy, I think he means well. Dennis, here's the issue. And I can be really hard on that issue, but I don't have to do it in a way that attacks you or belittles you or creates a personal animosity between us. That's not helpful to getting or resolving what might be a mutual problem, right? That's a frustration I see in the political system where, whether it's the country or the province or a municipality, the politicians I've met, generally are good people that are trying to make their place better.
Yep.
And but it just seems like when they're labeled on, one's one party, one's the other, instead of trying to figure a way to work together, it's more about that conflict instead of saying let's work together to kind of resolve this problem, right?
Yep.
That's frustrating to me.
Yeah, completely hear you. It resonates big time. And if we don't start having conversations that matter pretty soon, a lot of stuff is going to start to fall apart on us.
Yeah.
Because the province is so small, and if we don't get over the French-English thing, at some point we got to get over the French-English thing, because everyone's a first cousin or a second cousin at best, and get over the distribution of wealth thing because of that instinct or that push to want to win in the debate and personalize it. There's enough for all of us to go around, but we need a different conversation to recognize we're all part of the same place. We're coming from different points of view, but we're all part of the same place. So show me your version of the common good, I'll show you my version. Chances are 70% of it will be the same. We got that far. No, this other 30%, it might be a bit of a battle.
Yeah, so let's focus on the common interest so we haven't spent our energy there, right?
What I used to enjoy is Peter Zowski's Morningside program on CBC Radio, and used to have Kemp, Kearns, and Lewis on. So Dalton Kemp, Eric Kearns, and Stephen Lewis. they take their points of view, but they always paid attention to the whole. And it made for a great hour of conversation. Sometimes they'd be at each other a bit, but that was good creative tension. Most of the time they recognized they were just different, but they're part of the country and were responsible for the country. So labor movement could have a large voice in that if it could find its voice in a way. And because media often portray a negotiation in dollars and cents terms. And a lot of times it's a lot more than pay scale. So 18 years in the business. Changes?
There's been changes in the industry that I represent people in, primarily in the electrical utility industry, but we represent some other folks as well. But NB Power has gone through change. The electrical industry across North America has gone through a change, and what I'm seeing now is more so today than it might have been 15 years ago. Things that are occurring other places are having an impact here in New Brunswick, right? So whether it's what's going on in New England, or what's going to potentially happen, what's going on in Newfoundland or Quebec, like other things happen, and then we're need to respond to it, right? So I think that we need to be adaptive. I think that the key thing is, we talked a little bit about this, but I mean, you need to learn to be nimble, understand what's happening elsewhere, because a utility in Ohio doesn't trim their trees and it causes a blackout that takes out a third of North America. That happened 11 years ago, right? And as a result of that, certain regulations and things will be put in place that'll impact us here, right? So as a union leader in this industry, I need to know about that, and then hopefully understand what I can do to help our members be best prepared to be successful, in a changing environment, right?
Is it fair to ask, do you have a for instance? Do you see something coming on the horizon that we're going to need? I'm thinking of smart grid technology. Is that a value? A lot of times people will say we need to do more conservation, so households need to be tighter. And
so all that's happening. So in North America, well, I mean, look what's happened in New Brunswick here. We have a certain capacity to generate electricity, and based on a lot of electric base heater load, right? A lot of residents are heated with electric base heaters, but also industries like the pulp industry consumed a lot of energy, right? And then because of certain things that have happened, some of the pulp mills have shut down. So then we have surplus capacity, and NB Power ended up closing Dalhousie plant, traumatic for that area and those people, right? And working through those issues to help the workers there, through that situation. But the reality is, the plant was a good plant, technically good, and it was in great shape. But the fuel costs, the cost of fuel that it used, were higher and made it uneconomic, right? In an environment where we have surplus capacity. So, a bunch of factors came into play there. The price of the fuel, what's happened around other industry in this province. That's changed things. And when you look at the in the last 10 years, the economy in the United States and throughout Canada took a bit of a nosedive, which led to lower consumption of electricity. But the economy is rebounding, but we're not seeing electricity consumption kind of come back at the same level, right? And in large part because some of the devices that we use consume less electricity. If you think of an old television set, an old CRT, big old tube set, right, used a lot of energy, and now folks watch television on LEDs, which consume much less electricity. So, there's people that are conserving electricity, but even if you're not into that scene, the things that you're purchasing consume less energy, right? And so, what's that going to mean to our workers in the electrical industry going forward, right? What's the impact of smart grid, and how do we train our folks so that they can remain relevant in a world where the system may look completely different? Like, I've heard it said that if Thomas Edison were alive today, he'd recognize the distribution system because it basically hasn't changed much in that time, right? However, 20 years from now, it could be a lot different. So I need to make sure that our workers, our line workers, we started this conversation about them. When they go out and restore power now, for example, people have generators that may be putting back feed onto the grid, which could be a danger to them. So they need to be able to recognize that. Or what if folks have solar cells or windmill or whatever that can cause some technical challenges or some unsafe practices. So they need to be trained in what to recognize. And plus, as new technology is rolled out to enable a smart grid, I need to make sure that they have the tools so they can continue their careers and be successful, right? So that's kind of an example of things are changing. And it's not because somebody in Fredericton decided we're going to do something different.
Yeah.
It's because the world around us is changing.
Changing a lot. What you speak of reminds me of two conversations from this show that we've already had. Peter Corbin and green technology and getting localized, and Peter Linfield talking about shifts in economy at other places impacting New Brunswick scale. So do you think, following that theme, do you think there's a future or a growth window for that localized generation stuff? Because there's generation, distribution, and then the consumption side. And there's a real push amongst the green movement for a more localized generation, but the province is only 750,000 people, so.
That's the technology they refer to as distributed generation. And what I find is I'm kind of a, the way I look at things, like, there's usually extremes. Like I said, I consider myself a bit of an outsider in a lot of the stuff that I do, right?
You're one of Malcolm Gladwell's outliers.
I probably am, yeah. So, like folks who are maybe really hard environmentalists would say, go totally this way, right?
Yeah.
And others would say, we want large plants, that's the way we have to do it, right? And I think what will eventually evolve is somewhere in the middle. It'll be a combination of distributed generation backed up with large power plants, right? Because a lot of the
gotta have consistency.
Well,
of supply.
a lot of the new technology, whether it's wind or solar, it doesn't produce steady power 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, right? But our devices demand not only a steady supply of electricity, but a very high quality electricity. So you can't have the voltage changing by 1 volt. I mean, back in the day when all we had was an Edison light bulb, that didn't matter. The lights would dim, they get bright again, no problems, right?
Yeah.
We run a technological society that's dependent upon our IT infrastructure. And those devices cannot take a 1/10 of a volt regulation change. So, when it's windy and the more power's on the grid and there's less power on the grid, or solar and the cloud goes and it's varying up and down, you need to balance all those things because you need a straight line curve, right? And so there's always going to be a requirement, at least for the foreseeable number of decades, for large baseload plants. And what happens if it's just not windy? There was an example a few years ago. California has something like 20,000 megawatts of wind power capacity. And on one of the hottest days in the summer, when their load's at the highest, when there's a lot of air conditioning load, they were generating less than 200 megawatts from that wind. So over 19,800 was not generating at the time when they needed it, right?
Yep.
And so what if you'd abandoned all your baseload generation? Well, you just say, well, we don't have power and that's it, lights out in Los Angeles. But we can't have that, right?
Yep.
Same thing in this province. You need those backup plants, right? So then, there's a cost to that too, right? So it kind of rolls back to, we want green energy, but what is the cost of it, right? And so there's a balance between how green technologies will get deployed and how quickly the economy and people can absorb those costs, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's, wind right now is significantly more costly than our other types of generation. So on a really windy day, when it's really windy out, NB Power is losing money because they're paying more for that electricity than they could generate it through other means. Yeah. And that has an impact on our rates, right? But most folks wouldn't necessarily understand that, right?
Yep.
And so, I think that, I'm in favor of these green technologies, and I think they're going to come, but I don't think you can say we're going to go totally green next week, right? Because that our system couldn't tolerate it. People wouldn't want to pay that price, right? Yeah. But I think that it's going to evolve more in that direction as technology changes.
You're adding so much depth and understanding to all these pieces. Not long ago, there was a story in mainstream media about a small town in Germany that went 321% producing their own power. So they were over capacity, 321%. They just sold it back into the grid. They came up with this as a solution because they found where they were geographically situated was well suited to solar power, and then push it back into the grid, and that way they didn't have to raise taxes. They found another solution for it, and the country was kind of accommodating it. But it still had the same challenge that you spoke to, is the consistency of the generation side.
And they were fortunate, so in a system like that, they're actually using the whole grid as their battery.
Okay.
So if you're living off the grid in a cottage somewhere in the middle of the wherever, right? You would have a bunch of batteries, and you'd have solar or wind, and you'd charge up your batteries, and at night or when it wasn't windy, you could draw from those batteries, right? So folks doing something like that, they don't have battery, because first of all, batteries don't have the capacity to store the megawatts of energy that
yeah, it has to move.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can do a home, but you can't do a city with batteries, right? Yeah. And so what they're actually using the grid as their battery, right? Because they're feeding it in. But then when it's nighttime, they're actually drawing from the rest of the grid. So the thing is, there are baseload plants around that town in Germany, whether it could be 100 miles away or 600 miles away, or kilometers. Yeah. And so they're
making sure
using that infrastructure exists for them, right? But if you put a bubble over them, they're by themselves, their system wouldn't work. Because when they had too much capacity, they'd have no place to put it, and when they needed it, they'd have no place to draw it from, right? So it works good when you can balance everything out. And that's why there's some work being done right now about trying to balance wind across the Maritimes. So instead of just trying to balance in New Brunswick, we're balancing wind load in Nova Scotia, PEI, and New Brunswick across the other generating assets that are available, right?
Yeah. I remember seeing that wind map that was created around 2009 about all the areas, because we're a small province with 3 coasts, so there's got to be a lot of wind. It's whether or not you can harness it properly and make it consistent enough.
Yeah, and even some areas may be windy, but you're getting beyond my detailed knowledge, right? Yeah. But these windmills are so massive that depending on if the velocity of the wind at the top of the tower is less than at the bottom of the tower, it may not be suited for wind generation, right? Yeah.
I saw one on social media stuff last week where some MIT types got playing with things, and they can go 2,000 feet up with like a dirigible or like a Hindenburg, but it's not. Yeah. And they can get it up there with cables, but they've got the propeller on the inside of this spaceship-looking balloon, and they can get higher, more consistent currents and still draw it down to the ground. Yeah. They've got a bunch of other things to work out, like if the tether and all of that. But
so it's an example of evolving technologies, right? I mean, it's things are going to continue to evolve and change, right? Yeah. But right now, some distributed generation can be absorbed in the grid, but we cannot do away with the larger power plants. 100 years from now, it may be different.
Yeah. Do you see any changes that you'd like to see in the short term for that? Like, should households be spending more time on conservation and tightening up their houses, or they're paying more attention to the usage? Is there something that you'd like to see for the line workers that would make their worlds better? I'm thinking of that cyclical conversation of we want smaller government, they make cuts, then there's less people to go out during a crisis.
I think that we are probably, as lean as, now here's where it's going to sound like a stereotypical union guy, right?
Yeah, but that's okay to go with that, though.
But we are very lean. That's the reality, right?
There's no more room.
Yeah. I don't think there is much more. In fact, I think that, just on that one particular occupation, but many that I represent, in the power industry, there's an organization called the Electricity Human Resources Council. And they're a national body that looks at human resource needs within the electrical industry. And through successive studies, they renew it every 3 or 4 years. They're identifying that there is a growing shortage of people with the technical skills needed to maintain and build our grid. So sometimes, for example, you hear people say, well, we should have an east-west power line, a transmission line, so we could get power from the west coast of Canada and bring it east, right?
Yeah, east-west pipeline.
Yeah, well, yeah, but a great idea, but here's the reality, right?
That's right, the implementation.
There's not enough line workers in North America that could build a project like that. I mentioned earlier Muskrat Falls. One of the biggest risks they have is attracting enough line workers that can work on that project. And it's because it's an occupation where utilities used to, up to maybe 20 years ago, all utilities would hire so many apprentices. They'd hire people, and you're going to be an apprentice line worker.
Yep.
And it would take 4 years. They'd learn kind of mentoring on the job, and they would end up a journey person, fully qualified line worker. Well, United States adopted competition and deregulation, and a lot of private utilities down there. And so one utility figured out that it was cheaper, instead of hiring people and putting them through the cost of a training program, they could hire fully qualified line workers and poach them from other utilities.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I'm thinking of had a standing offer that if you wanted a job with them, they would fly the line worker and their spouse down, show them around, and offer them a job. So they started poaching from other utilities. So then those other utilities said, well, why are we training people?
Yep.
So they could be poached by these guys. So they started doing the same thing, right?
Yep.
So there was a period of time there where the industry trained very few line workers, right? And then, you know, utilities started saying, well, we don't have enough line workers, but, you know, if it's a storm just, you know, in the southern part of the state or this province, you know, we can get help from other utilities. So that's how they dealt with that, you know. So, you know, we have a problem here, Nova Scotia Power send people, or Hydro-Quebec, or Nova Scotia has a power, we'll send them in, right? Yep. And so they get by with a few or less people, right? And then, but at a certain point, you know, the people you're relying on, you know, you're 50, now you're 60, and then, you know, at some point you just say, I can't climb poles anymore, right? Yep. Well, in the meantime, we haven't done a good enough job, the industry anywhere, of bringing people in the front end, right? Yep. And it's not just power, like line workers, like they're the most visible ones, but the reality is the same issue exists in power plant operators, electrical instrumentation control technicians, you know, chemical technicians, you name it. A lot of these technical jobs, the utility industry, you know, has done a poor job in the last 2 decades, the last 3 decades of kind of onboarding people. And now there's a competition for a limited number of bodies, right? And that's a real challenge. I think it's something that like I said, the Electricity Human Resources Council is looking at. Utilities are starting to pay attention to this too, because, you know, the same people they're looking for are the same ones that are in demand by other industries. And at the end of the day, will they be able to get, you know, will the people even exist? So now now they're talking about, you know, can we obtain these resources? We can't get them in North America, you know, where can we get them from? And, you know, I'm not talking about, you know, non-skilled temporary foreign workers. I'm talking about trying to attract highly skilled people from elsewhere, right? And I just think, you know, there's so much opportunity, you know, particularly a place like New Brunswick. You know, line workers are a great occupation. So why aren't we hiring more line workers or training more of them, right?
Yeah, doing a mentorship program and figuring out where the entry point is and nurturing it.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of young people trying to find work and wanting to stay home.
Yeah.
So it sounds like something's off on the strategy.
It's right across. As I said, it's a continental thing. It's I think it'll eventually correct itself, but there's going to be a real pinch point. And because a lot of our infrastructure, not just here, but throughout North America, you know, a lot of it's about 40, 50 years old. Mm-hmm. A lot of it needs to be rebuilt. It's at the end of its life, right?
Just like conversations on bridges and some roads.
Exactly.
If you factor in climate change, if you're one of those that believes it, some roads are going to have to move because the ocean level is going to go up. Those things. All kinds of opportunities then buried in that shift that needs to occur. Yeah. But any sense of what that tipping point might be? For somebody's going to need to let go. Mm-hmm. Is where I'm getting
well, I think
to, because there's a paradigm that's gotten us this far, but it doesn't seem to want to sustain itself anymore. It's like it wants to collapse. But if it does collapse, it's going to have the consequences are going to be too dire. And I mean on the human resource side. Yeah. So where's the tipping point, or what would you offer as suggestions for what we should be doing to make sure that that doesn't happen as the retirees kick in and younger people come in?
Well, I think, you know, some organizations are you know, starting to recognize this and address it, whether it's, you know, some companies or even unions. You know, I attended a meeting a couple weeks ago in Ottawa, national training meeting we have. And it's a partnership between the IBEW and the Electrical Contractors Association, the national organization. And it's, you know, for folks who do training, you know, typically focused on apprenticeship training. And they were sharing best practices and ways that we can help apprentices coming into the system be successful. You know, sharing ideas around attracting apprentices into certain occupations. And so there's things that are happening, right? But I think it will get to a point where there will be a tipping point, you know, when, you know, and I think we're getting there, where folks will say, okay, we've got a real issue here, we need to do something to address this, right? And unfortunately, it'll probably be, you know, something like another ice storm or something like that, or like, you know, when I mentioned earlier the power blackout 11 years ago, you know, at a very high level, federal governments started to think about the reliability of the grid and the fact that if, you know, a problem occurs in Ohio, you can take down Ontario and, you know, big part of the continent, right? And so, you know, at that point, you know, stronger emphasis put on international standards and, you know, regulations that require certain levels of reliability. And I think that you're probably going to just see that kick in even more, but I think it'll take like a disruption of the system.
Needs a precipitating event.
Yeah, probably. And
for it to shift into social
yeah,
policy instead of strategic planning and foresight. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of push on governments these days to have evidence-based policy. I suspect you guys might have an awful lot of evidence that you could provide about why these decisions should be made. On the towers, just the physical infrastructure, there must be a shelf life for that kind of stuff, just like there is for bridges. I'm thinking of Montreal talking about the Champlain Bridge needing to be refurbished. Massive project, goodness. So is it political will or common sense to pay attention to the towers, their loads and maintenance?
Yeah, so I'd say that the utility, like, you know, our utility, you know, as I mentioned, I can find bad examples in the United States, and primarily, you know, investor-owned utilities that in a competitive market, you know, with other utilities, and so there's not a lot of incentive there to necessarily do the investment. But, you know, we've maintained a Crown corporation that, you know, is regulated, and I can tell you that the, you know, the culture there is to, you know, it's very much an engineering organization too, right? So they're paying attention to this. I know that just within the last month, I've been at a meeting with some of the folks from transmission, and they've been looking over the last period of time, you know, at all the transmission assets in this province, and, you know, recognizing that they are kind of reaching, you know, a point where they will need to be replaced or have some major refurbishments done. So they're looking at this and taking a long-term view, like over the next 10 years, what do they need to do? And I know that they're looking at some serious investments spread out over that period of time to make sure that the system remains reliable. But there's other utilities, and, you know, our folks will come back from visiting other places, or maybe they're helping them with storm restoration, and they'll say that, man, some of the systems, you know, around us are in very poor shape.
And that gets into another discussion, which is publicly owned utilities or publicly owned corporations, and then the privately investor-driven ones, because there are two different operational models.
Absolutely.
And during any time, that topic will surface from time to time, that you should sell off the Crown corporations, be run more efficiently, because private sector knows better. And I always found that a bit of a straw man kind of argument, because they never completed the circle to the overall benefit of a public utility, because its obligation is different, and yet it still does make money. And in NBA Power's case, if you go back far enough, you'll find, you know, there'll be some who believe the political interference caused the challenges that the power company faced 10 years later or so. But it doesn't matter now, because we're in today and how to move forward. But do you have other thoughts about why NBA Power should stay, you know, public? Because that was a big driver 4 years ago in an election campaign.
So I mean, there's no question in my mind at all that, particularly in the power sector, it's a little bit different than, you know, I can't comment about all types of corporate Crown corps, but you know, the electricity sector is it's an essential service,
and it's a shared wealth too.
We rely upon it, though, but you can't live here. You know, the middle of winter when it's 30 below, if the power were out for a month, people would die, right? So, you know, it is an essential service. It's necessary for the health, safety, and of the public, right? A Crown corporation can run their business more effectively and at a lower financial cost than a private company. A private company needs to generate between 12 and 14% rate of return for their shareholders. So that's over and above any operating costs. So then, you know, the proponents of privatization would say, yes, but they'll be running it more efficiently and more effectively. And I'd say, so where's the proof of that? You know, there's nothing that says that a Crown corporation cannot run as effectively and efficiently as a private corporation. Now, folks would say, well, perhaps political interference, and I would agree with that. But if you're in a utility that's regulated by a utilities board, which, you know, maybe Power is, and they're strengthening that, then, you know, that takes away, you know, interference, right? So that, you know, the utility board will mandate a certain level of reliability, and, you know, obviously there's some tension there, right? Because they're also there to represent the public, right?
Yep.
So hopefully they're trying to find that sweet spot, right, where you're getting the right kind of bang for your buck. But I just totally reject the idea that a private company can do a better job than a publicly owned power utility. And there is examples right across North America. Like when you think, if you look at, a classic one, it's not electricity, but natural gas, Enron. Private companies, which are just run to maximize shareholder value,
Yep.
they're not necessarily living in the community where the results of their decisions are occurring, right?
Yep.
And, energy is, so variable, like it's a volatile market that, there have been areas where, utilities have, private-owned utilities have gamed the market. It's so easy in California to just, have your nuclear plant go offline, and then all of a sudden the price of electricity triples, and companies can make a ton of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would not happen in our type of system. I'm just a strong believer of the crown corporations across Canada being able to supply this essential service in the most effective and efficient way. That doesn't say that we mustn't always strive for ways to, be aware that we serve the public and we need to do things in an effective and efficient way, right?
Yep.
But I just say that we can do it as good or better than a private company, and we've got that 10 to 12 to 14% difference in that allows us to keep the rates that much lower.
As well as another key thing you said, which is that you live here.
Yeah.
So you're close to your decisions.
Correct.
Yeah, that's a key point, because a lot of times when it's managed from a distance, it's of no consequence.
Yeah. The folks that work in NB Power, and my members IBEW, like when the power is out, we started this conversation around. I mean, those are our parents that are out of power, right? Or our cousins or our friends, right? And so we have an interest in making sure that we have a reliable system.
Yep. The another thing that'll come up when talking about New Brunswick trying to get some economic foothold, how do we improve our unemployment rates, those sorts of things. They'll talk about the cost of power for doing business. Mm-hmm. There's two sides that tend to want to surface. One that'll say that we still have cheap power compared to other places in the world. And then there'll be those who say, no, the cost of power is too expensive. Do you have a sense of where we fit?
Yeah, so generally I would say our power rates compare favorably anywhere in North America. I think we have the lowest rates in the Atlantic region, if excluding Quebec, and after Muskrat Falls, I'm not sure the impact there, but our rates are low. However, I know there's some jurisdictions where, and I'm thinking about residential rates, right? Okay. There's some jurisdictions that have favorable rates for industry. Mm-hmm. And there's a justification for that to some extent, because if I'm serving 1,000 residential customers, at 1,000 different homes, and I've run 1,000 different lengths of wire, right? Yeah. Versus a factory that consumes the same amount of energy
with one line.
One line, right? Yeah. And so there's a justification for lower costs.
Good point.
But some places are using it as an economic development tool, right? So they're offering them lower rates, and so that it'll stimulate activity, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe, I think that's like a public policy decision, and the folks that live in that area need to understand what it means and the impacts.
But generally speaking, we are competitive, therefore it could be one of our strong selling points. Yeah. If you come and set up shop in New Brunswick, we have really competitive power rates that are stable with an infrastructure that's stable.
Yeah. So for example, Lion's building a data center in St. John, right? And I know that, and this is something that's totally changed in the last 10 years, our reliance on data and cloud-based data and these big data centers, right? Yep. And, in New Brunswick, the political climate here is safe, there's areas, of this province which geographically are very stable, could be a great area to pursue for data centers, perhaps.
Because Google, everybody uses Google, but they might not be aware of Google's carbon footprint, for example, because where they put their data centers looking for the cheapest power, which tends to be coal-based, somewhere in the Midwest. Yeah.
So we've got surplus capacity right now. Maybe this would be a great spot for Google to build a data center, and in the northern part of the province, wouldn't that be awesome, in the Dalhousie area? Yep. But that's a construction cost, and of course I guess what we need to do is find industry that'll employ people on an ongoing basis in a data center probably creates more employment on the construction than it does in its operation, right? But I mean, I think that there's lots of opportunities here.
We're more or less done for time. Something you want to close off with? We have a couple minutes left, so it's something we didn't touch on, or as we meander through this great conversation, something you'd like to bring up?
Well, just one thing I was thinking of earlier, you asked the question, like, how do you help people understand some of these very complex issues, right? And one thing I want to give a lot of credit to is the energy blueprint that's out right now. One of the things that they did was say they'd like to, they actually asked UMB to develop a program around energy literacy.
Okay.
And so I was fortunate enough, I went through the first program, and they've done a second cohort, but it's something they're trying to get more people involved and spread out a little bit into folks that it would be really helpful if they had a good, strong understanding of how all the aspects of the energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas or oil, how all those things kind of come together and the important part it plays here in New Brunswick.
That'd be great.
And it was 6 3-day modules. I went through the whole thing, and I always felt I was a pretty knowledgeable guy, but I learned a lot of things, right? And around regulation and other types of energy that I'm not as familiar with, natural gas, or if you look at shale gas extraction and those types of things. Like, we had experts there talking to us, and credible, reputable people around all aspects of that, and we could ask questions. And I feel that after having that training, through the UMB, I'm much more knowledgeable. And when these things are happening, when there's changes occurring, I feel I can have a good conversation with people or help others understand, right? But it'd be good if more people did, because so many times a day, when there's important issues that are impacting us as a province, it'll devolve down to a point of view totally opposed and one that's totally for, and a lot of area in the middle, and then folks just don't know, and so you become cynical because all you're hearing is from maybe folks that have vested interests, and people don't know what to believe, right? So to the extent that we could help everybody in New Brunswick understand some of these issues, I think we'd be better off as a province. I think that I've been involved with a project that Andy Scott had started, Learning Everybody's Project, trying to look at ways of raising the level of education in the K-12, but also post-secondary, and also work, education once you enter the workplace, and then when you're done working, what are we doing to create educational opportunities for our people who are retired people and people within the communities. Like, when we do those things, I think that we'll be better off as a province.
That's awesome. Well, thanks very much.
No problem. Thank you.
We
Dennis.
wrap it up.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great. As always, be good, have fun, and love each other.